Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to session 110 of the Harborne Islamic Study Circle, HISC, where we're continuing with the Seerah, or the Seerah session 110, which is the 8th that we're doing on the Battle of Badr. And last time we talked about just as the tide had turned, Khalid bin Walid, he's led the counter-offensive, taken them out to the archers, and he's trying to drive a wedge between the main body of the Muslim army and the Prophet ﷺ in the rear. And the Prophet ﷺ, he's in his sort of army headquarters, surrounded by 9 people, his personal guard, including 2 of the Muhajir, 7 of the Ansar. And then in this really critical phase, we see how the charge of Khalid bin Walid's men leads to the death one by one of each of the archers, or each of the 7 Ansar who were defending the Prophet, and then he's left with only 2. And some narrations say this happened as the Prophet is trying to retreat, or he's up towards his little cave in Uhud. And others say, well, they went to the cave a bit later on, because obviously in the counteroffensive a lot more face-to-face combat happened, and it necessarily can't happen when they're up on the hill. And so part of that counteroffensive, we heard about how when the Prophet got hit him on the helmet, got the rings lodged into his cheeks, got shot by some arrows, got his tooth broken, and the arrows lodged into his cheeks. So quite a critical time in the Prophet. And at some point in time, it may have been when he was just down to the last 2, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent 2 angels dressed in white, fiercely defending the Prophet. But obviously, despite that, he was still injured, and obviously there's a lot of wisdom there for us in terms of even the Prophet was injured, and nothing's taken for granted. And we'll come and talk about that inshallah next time or the week after, when we talk about some of the lessons from the Battle of Uhud. And then we also talked about some of the specific examples of the Sahabi and their acts of heroism during the battle, and it's important to recognize these people, to mention their names. These are our heroes. These are the people we should be familiar with, their names, their activities, and the things that they've done, and the reasons we should be proud of them. So people like Malik bin Sinan, who was the one, as they were cleaning the Prophet's cheek, that the blood was flowing. He's the one that cleaned some of the blood, and the Prophet told him to spit out the blood, and he said no, and then he plunged into the battle, and he became shaheed. We talked about Abu Talha bravely defending the Prophet from arrows, lifting up his chest, and basically taking the physical hit from the arrows so they don't hit the Prophet, and the Prophet shooting arrows alongside Abu Talha, and obviously the great knight of the Prophet's time, Abu Dujana, protecting the back of the Prophet, and also going into the fray a bit later on and killing a few people. So Abu Dujana, he chopped in half the Quraysh who injured Harith bin Asimma, and then it was the spear of Harith bin Asimma that the Prophet used to kill Ubay bin Khalaf, and Ubay was one of the vile opponents of the Prophet and the Muslims in Makkah, who promised the Prophet he's feeding a horse, and he'll kill the Prophet whilst he's charging on that horse. And the Prophet says, no, you're going to be the one that I'm going to kill. And this is the only person that we know of who the Prophet killed in battle, through his own direct efforts, and that was through spearing him in the neck. And he died later on because of that. And again, Ubay bin Khalaf, he was one of those people who hated the Prophet, didn't accept he was the Prophet, but believed every word he said, because he said if the Prophet was to even spit at him, he would die. And so he knew that when the Prophet ﷺ speared him, this was a mortal wound. We also talk about Hatib bin Baltaha, who killed Utbah ibn Abi Waqqas, who was the one who broke the Prophet ﷺ's tooth. We've talked about Abdurrahman ibn Auf, who received over 20 wounds during the fighting. There was the story of Nusayba or Amara, who injured her shoulder badly whilst defending the Prophet ﷺ. Then Harith bin Samma, we talked about Musab ibn Umair, the unfortunate death of Musab ibn Umair, who was holding the banner of Islam. People were then rallying around Musab. And then Ibn Qamiya, he on his horse, he's the one that hit the Prophet ﷺ in the face. He also strikes and chops off Musab's right hand and then his left hand, and then finishes him off. And then once he's killed Musab ibn Umair, he starts to shout out that he's killed the Prophet. I've killed the Prophet. I've killed Muhammad. I've killed Muhammad is what he's shouting, and that causes even more confusion, both on the side of the Muslims and even on the side of the Quraysh. Some of the Quraysh, then they lose their will to carry on fighting because they think, well, their mission accomplished. The Prophet ﷺ is dead. And on the Muslim side, some of the Muslims think, well, the Prophet's died, what do we have to fight for now? Whereas other people had a very different attitude, and we talked about Anas bin An-Nadr, who disavowed all these doubters and says, look, just because the Prophet ﷺ died doesn't mean that the whole of Islam is gone, or the mission is gone, or Allah's died, or anything like that. But you need to fight for the cause of Allah. And he passes Saad bin Mu'adh, and he says to Saad, look, I smell Jannah, and then he jumps into the battle and he becomes shaheed, and he's so badly injured, over 80 wounds, spears, arrows, sword wounds, daggers, cuts, everything, that the only way they could recognize him was his sister recognized him from the tips of his fingers on the battlefield afterwards. And then other heroic stories, people like Thabit and Datha, and so we went through these stories, and then slowly, gradually, the Muslims rallying around the Prophet ﷺ, and how Qab ibn Malik was the one of those to recognize the Prophet ﷺ through his armor. He could recognize his eyes, his piercing bright eyes, and then he shouts out, that Muhammad is alive. Here is Muhammad. Here is the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ, tells him to just keep quiet because he doesn't want to give away his position yet again amidst all that confusion. So another couple of interesting things that are recorded in this battle, the confusion that's around this time. Some of the Sahabi, they narrate that they were overcome by a desire to sleep on the battlefield amidst all this chaos, with the enemy literally in their face. That Allah, allowed some of them to have a power nap, essentially, and then they became re-energized because of that. And Abu Talha says that I was one of those who was possessed by a desire to sleep on the day of Uhud, and on that day my sword fell out of my hand several times. Again and again it fell down, and again I picked it up. So again, it's just a really strange phenomenon. You'd think with all the adrenaline flowing, sleep would be the last thing on your mind, but yet here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blesses some of his warriors with this. So it seemed with all of this, and the Muslims finally rallying around the Prophet ﷺ, and gathering momentum, withdrawing from the battlefield and coalescing around the Prophet ﷺ, providing this sort of shield of protection. Amongst the Quraysh, many of them still not aware that the Prophet ﷺ is alive. They're sort of quietly melting away out of the battle. Some of the others are intent on fighting, and so there's mixed messages. So the Prophet ﷺ, he then withdraws with this group of Muslims further up the mountain. And as he's withdrawing, he sees that there's a big rock that's blocking the pathway. The Prophet, he tries to climb on top of the rock, but he's laden with his heavy armor. He's been wounded, and it's been a grueling day, and he just can't get on top of it. And then it's recorded that Talha, he sat in such a way that the Prophet was able to climb on him and then get on, stand on his sort of back and his shoulders, and then climb the rock, and then he was in a much safer position. And then after this, the Prophet, after all the heroics that Abdullah had done on the day in defending the Prophet and being his physical shield to the arrows, the Prophet, and then helping him climb to safety, the Prophet then said to Talha, after this job you are eligible for the Garden of Paradise. And so the Prophet, he settles down and gathers up his sort of headquarters as they're sort of up on the mountain. The Quraysh, some of the Quraysh, the knights, certainly they recognise that the Prophet is potentially up there, or otherwise why would the Muslims be sort of coalescing in a group there? And they try to launch an offensive up the hill, but again, it's very difficult for them. The Prophet on the higher ground, they're on the mountain. It's hard to get up, and again, that's part of the tactical genius of the Prophet in choosing that spot rather than a very barren open plain where they could have fought. And so there is this sort of one last counter-offensive that the Quraysh try to launch, and the Prophet turns to Saad and he goes, drive them off. And Saad goes, well, how can I drive them off without anyone to sort of help me, essentially? And so the Prophet then took some arrows out of his quiver and handed them to Saad, who shot them one by one, and he's gradually aiming at these people, killing some of them, and then sort of warding off the others. And then he said, then I took another one. Saad said, look, I took an arrow out of his quiver, shot it and killed the guy. Then I took another one I know to be good, and I shot it and got the other man. Then the third that I also know was a good fighter, I killed the third one. And then consequently, as Saad managed to sort of target all three of these with his expert archery skills, the rest of the people, they climbed down the mountain. So then he said, look, this must be a blessed arrow, and he sort of and bow, and he put it in his quiver, and it said that Saad kept that until he died, and he passed it on to his children, who kept it after that. So I think they're the main sort of stories of the battles, the combat that happened on the day of Uhud. The rest of the stuff is around sort of the mutilation of some of the shaheed, what some of the ladies did on the day, and then the negotiations that Abu Sufyan and the Quraysh have as they leave. Some stories of some of the wounded, and then the burial of the martyrs. So we'll, and then Prophet obviously returns to Medina after that. So we'll see how far we'll get with that, but certainly it is just very. That's the end of the main, combat on the Battle of Uhud, and it's been a devastating time for the Muslims. Initially winning, the archers making the fatal mistake, coming down the mountains. Khalid bin Walid seeing that, taking his opportunity, capturing the mount of the archers, killing all 10 of them, and then just sweeping down and causing utter chaos, which leads to many more Muslims dying and the Prophet getting badly injured. But know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept his promise, and the Muslims were initially victorious. And we'll come on to that when we'll do some of the verses relating to the battle, inshallah, in the coming week or two. So many of the Quraysh were convinced that, with what Ibn Qayyim said, that he'd killed the Prophet ﷺ. So many of them, they just returned to their base camp and they started preparations to go back to Makkah. So many of the Muslims had withdrawn or retreated, but they weren't actually going to have active combat. And this is the point in time when sort of the battlefield is quiet, the victors are there, the Muslims have retreated, that we got the mutilation of the martyrs, of the shaheed. And lots of stories that a lot of the bodies of the Muslims were mutilated, none more prominently recorded than that of Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. So stories, as I say, of people, women who were initially running away, coming back, cutting off the ears, the noses, and even the private parts of some of the shaheed, and it's cutting open their bellies, and this is the thing that's said to have happened to Hamza. So Hind bin Utbah, the wife of Abu Sufyan, she was one of those who asked to find Hamza, found the slain body of Hamza that Wahshi had killed, ripped open the stomach of Hamza, cut out the liver, and then started chewing on it, and then for whatever reason found it unpleasant. She spat it out, and again she'd made anklets or necklaces out of the ears and the noses, and some say the fingers of some of the Muslims. So very brutal scene on the battlefield. Ka'b bin Malik, he said, "Look, I was one of those Muslims who fought on the day of Uhud, and I witnessed the acts of barbarity of the mushrikeen when they were mutilating the dead bodies. But then I just had to pass them by. I couldn't do anything. What could Ka'b do? Their army is lost, and the Quraysh are just rampant, and they're just going around doing all sorts of brutalities. I said, look, there's nothing I could do, but I couldn't stand it either. So he moved on." And then he said, "Look, I saw an armed, stout mushrik passing through the Muslims, and then shouting out, gather them up and combine them in the way that sheep are gathered and slaughtered." Then he said, "Look, similarly, I saw an armed Muslim man waiting for him. So I walked towards them, away from where some of the bodies were, and then I stood behind them, and I was comparing both of them. So there's one mushrik who's mutilating the bodies, and then he sees someone else just standing there waiting for him, and then he's eyeing both of them up, and he says, look, I saw that the mushrik was bigger, stronger, had more of a imposing figure than the other person, and I kept on watching, and then until they sort of met up, and then they started in face-to-face single combat, and then said that the Muslim then thrust at the mushrikeen so quick, it's as if he missed him, and then he looked that the mushrikeen was then split in two down to his hip, and then when the Muslim took off his helmet, he turned around to Ka'b, who was standing there, and then he said to Ka'b, "What about that, Ka'b? I'm Abu Dujana." So so Abu Dujana knew that Ka'b was watching him. He had an audience, and he was there to do a job and made sure that this mushrik who was mutilating the bodies wasn't able to do that anymore. Other quotes from the Battle of Uhud, we find that some of the recording is of some of the Muslims who were helping out on the day, and some of the ladies who'd come from Medina. So stories of Ayman. She was one of those who saw the Muslim fighters as they were coming back following the first counteroffensive from Khalid bin Walid. Some of the Muslims, we talked about, some of them ran away, some of them were dejected and stayed, and some of them fought to defend the Prophet ﷺ. So of those that ran and went back to Medina thinking that they'd lost, Ayman, she picked up and threw dust in their faces and just having a go at them, and she goes back to her house, comes out with a spinning wheel, the thing that the ladies make for cotton or for embroidery, and she hands it to some of the men folks, and take it and give up carrying swords. So why have you come back? You're worse than women, and then it said that she raced back to her house and got some watering jars, and then she raced to the battlefield, and she tended the wounded, and as she's tending to the wounded, one of the Quraysh shot an arrow at her. Saad bin Ar-Rabi shot an arrow, and then she dodged it and fell back, and then as she fell on the floor, some of her clothes were lifted up, and then seeing that, the Quraysh started laughing again. They just on this high, having think that they've won and they've accomplished their mission, and they're just pure arrogance and evil. So the Prophet, he sat on the mountain. You can see that happening. So he turns to Saad ibn Abi Waqqas, and he gives him an arrow, and he says to Saad, shoot it. But the arrow lacked its arrowhead, so the front sort of metallic piercing arrowhead, he didn't have that, but he just handed him the blunt arrow, and he says, shoot it. So Saad shot it, and then it pierced the mushrikeen's throat, and then he fell down, and some of his body parts were revealed as he sort of fell to the ground, and then it said the Prophet ﷺ laughed so much that you could see the backs of his teeth, and Saad avenged her, and Allah responded to her dua. So even on the battlefield, amongst all this sort of doom and gloom, there is bits of merriment there. So that's one of the stories that's recorded. Then another story is that Ali ibn Abi Talib, he went out to fill his water container from the water from Al-Mihras, and that's said to be one of these sort of shallow bits of rock that gathers water, contains water, and it can be very stagnant, and it's possibly linked to one of the springs on Mount Uhud. But anyway, Ali ibn Abi Talib, he brought some water from that sort of little hollow rock for the Prophet ﷺ to drink, and the Prophet ﷺ, as he's about to drink it, he finds that it sort of smells really bad, so then he refused to drink it, but still used it to wash the blood off his face, and poured some of it over his head, saying, "May Allah's wrath be on those who besmeared the messenger's face with blood." And again, we talked about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mildly rebuked the Prophet ﷺ for some of these du'as against the mushrikeen. We'll come on back onto that inshallah when we do the lessons. Also, Sa'al said, by Allah, I know who washed the wound of the Messenger of Allah and who poured out the water for him and what substances his wound was treated. And he says his daughter Fatima washed it, and then Ali poured the water out of the container. And then when Fatima realized that the water just increased the blood flow, she's pouring the water, and it's as the initial blood clot that's congealed comes off, it's still bleeding quite heavily. So then, whether it was here or back at camp or in Medina, she then takes a piece of straw mat, she lights it, burns it, makes it into a paste, and then not quite cauterizes it, but sort of sticks it on the wound, so the blood stops flowing. And then during this time, Muhammad ibn Maslama, he went and brought some fresh water to the Prophet to drink, and the Prophet made dua. And then, as it's coming towards the end of the day, owing to the wounds that the Prophet had, the effects of the wounds on his body, the armor, and how tired he was, Prophet then led his followers in prayer in a seating position, and so did the Muslims. So the Prophet he's sort of sat and praying, and so did a lot of the other injured people. So that you have to excuse some of the birds. They're very excited, certainly at this time in the evening. But anyway, and you might be able to hear the thunder in the distance. But anyway, moving on. So Abu Sufyan, it's sort of things are being wrapped up now. It's the end of the day. Sufyan, somebody goes back and gets Abu Sufyan because he's the head of the army, and he scarpered when the initial charge, the offensive of the Muslims happened, and they broke through the ranks of the Quraysh, and then all the Quraysh ran hither thither, and Abu Sufyan was one of those who ran hither thither, and we don't know where he went, but obviously he'd have an entourage who'd be protecting him. But then Khalid bin Walid sends for him, and now things have quietened down. Abu Sufyan comes back to take charge of his army, essentially. So then he went to the mountain, because that's where all the Muslims are gathered. That's where they're sort of encamped and sort of defending themselves. The Quraysh did try to get up there, but then Saad shot the arrows and they've come down. So Abu Sufyan, so he goes to the foot of the mountain, and then he starts calling out, "Is Muhammad amongst you?" No response. And the Prophet he instructs his followers not to say anything. So, is Muhammad amongst you? Abu Sufyan's chanting out. No response. There's silence. Then he asks, is Ibn Qahafa amongst you? I.e. Abu Bakr. So, is Abu Bakr amongst you? Again, the Prophet told him not to answer. And then he asks, is Umar bin al-Khattab amongst you? Because Abu Sufyan, he doesn't know what happened on the battlefield. He's heard rumors and counter rumors, and so he's trying to establish the facts. And he even at this point in time, early on in the Medina seerah, you find that it's quite clear, and then Abu Sufyan stops after that. It's quite clear, not just amongst the Muslims, but amongst the non-Muslims and the enemies, who the lieutenants, who the next major people that the Prophet relies on are. So there's the Prophet, there's Abu Bakr, and there's Umar, in that order. So Abu Sufyan said, look, is Muhammad there? Abu Bakr there? Umar there? silence. And they're the only three that he asks for. So then with no response, Abu Sufyan then addresses the rest, what he thinks the rump of the army, and he goes, well, as for these three, we have relieved you of them. They're basically saying, these guys, if they're dead, they're dead. You should be thankful that, the mischief has been managed. And then at that, the characteristic of Umar ibn al-Khattab, this is obviously who he is. He just could not help it. I mean, he's burning up inside, his pride, his anger, his emotions, and then he just, blurts out, "O enemy of Allah, those who you've just mentioned, I am here to tell you that they are still alive, and Allah has maintained what you hate." Okay, so the three that you mentioned, they're alive. So you think that you come here, you hate them, but Allah has maintained them. So then Abu Sufyan says, okay, fair enough. You will find on the battlefield a lot of things that have happened, including the mutilation of those of yours whom we've killed. That's something that I did not order, but know that it doesn't displease me either. I am basically saying, look, when you come down and you collect your wounded, you'll find a lot of them have been mutilated. But this is not official policy. But I'm not bothered by it. Essentially what he's saying. So then he says, raise up Hubal, which is their idol. And this is the main idol of the Quraysh. This is the first idol that was brought many centuries ago. So he says, raise up Hubal, let him be sublime, let it be sublime. And then at that point, the Prophet then turns to the Sahabi and says, why don't you reply? And they're saying, well, how should we reply? So he's Abu Sufyan, saying, raise up Hubal, let it be sublime, let it be sublime. So the Prophet then said, say, Allah is more sublime and Allah is exalted and mightier as well. So he's saying, let Hubal be sublime, and then the Prophet will say, Allah is more sublime and mightier than that. And the response of the Prophet said in Arabic rhymed with what Abu Sufyan was trying to say. So again, it's sort of a battle of words, a battle of poetry almost, even on the battlefield. So that's Hubal. So then Abu Sufyan says Al-Uzza and another idol, and they thought Al-Uzza was Al-Manat and Al-Uzza were the angels who were the daughters of the Prophet were daughters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, again astaghfirullah. But this is what the Quraysh thought. They worshipped Al-Uzza and Al-Manat, but he's saying, raise up Al-Uzza. Uzza is ours and you have no Uzza. And the Prophet turns to the Sahabi and says, well, reply, why don't you reply? And what should we reply? So then he says, well, say Allah is our protector, our Mawla, and you have no protector. So there he's saying, Uzza is ours and you've got no Uzza. And they said, well, reply to them, say Allah is our protector and you have no Mawla. So then Abu Sufyan says, okay, well, deeds, let's talk about actions then. Today is a day of retaliation, vengeance for Badr. Tit for that, this for that. War is attended with alternate success. Some days you win, some days we win. And then Umar replied to that, no, they are not the same. It's not tit for tat. Know that our men who are killed, they are in Jannah, but yours are in hellfire. So again, really good counter sucker punch to what Abu Sufyan's trying to say and get away with. And so Abu Sufyan, he's sort of big sigh and he goes, oh, come down Umar, come down Umar. So then the Messenger of Allah turns to the Umar ibn Khattab and says, "Go and see what he wants, see what the matter is. Why is he calling you?" So he went down so they could almost eyeball each other. So then Abu Sufyan again, he's still not sure. So he goes, "I beseech you by Allah's name to tell me the truth. Have we really killed Muhammad?" So it's like, forget all the bravado, forget all the hype. Man to man, tell me in all honesty, have we killed him? And then Umar said, "Oh Allah, no." And know that he is listening to your words. So basically saying, look, you haven't killed him, and he can hear what you're saying. So then Abu Sufyan gets the reassurance from Umar. He trusts what Umar says. He's eyeballed him. He knows he's telling the truth. And so he turns to Umar and says, "For me, you are more truthful than Ibn Qamiyah and even more reliable." So Ibn Qamiyah was the one who hit the Prophet. He's the one who killed Musab bin Umair. He's the one who's going around bragging to the whole army that he's killed Muhammad. So Abu Sufyan, because he wasn't on the battlefield, he's heard these rumors, and Ibn Qamiyah is going around bragging, thinking he's got the bragging rights that he's killed Muhammad. So Abu Sufyan needs that personal reassurance from a reliable, trusted source. Have they killed him or not? So he gets that from his point of view. Abu Sufyan's bad news that Prophet is still alive. And then he gathers up, and then he's heading out, and then he turns around and he says, "We will meet again at Badr next year." Okay, and then the Messenger of Allah said to one of his men, "Yes, that's an appointment for both of us." So, Battle of Badr, Prophet and the Muslims, by the grace of Allah, decimated the Quraysh. 1 year later, the Quraysh come back, counter offensive, and they think that they have won. Okay, they've certainly killed a lot more of the Muslims than the Quraysh who've been killed on the day. So they think it's honours even now. And so they're saying, okay, 1-1, best of 3. We're going to meet again next year at Badr. So they make the appointment, and we'll talk about Badr next time. I mean, they basically didn't show up, but we'll talk about that. So then Abu Sufyan and the remainder of his army and his elites, they go back, they pick up their things, no doubt take any booty along with them, and they go back. And the Prophet then he dispatched Ali ibn Abi Talib to basically track them, and says, pursue them and see what they're going to do, and see what the aim of it is. So he's there as a scout, as a spy, with the instructions. Basically, if they come off their horses, get onto their camels, it means that they are heading back for Makkah. They're planning for the long journey back. But if they stay on their horses and then they just leave the camels unmounted, then it means that they are leaving for Medina. By the one in whose hand my soul is, if they attacked Medina, I would march to them there and I would fight them. And then Ali said, I went out and I traced them to see what they're up to, and I saw them getting on their camels and then leaving their horses unmounted. So they were heading back to Makkah. So even at the end of such a long, grueling day, and this is from Fajr time onwards, and then the battle, the offensive, counter-offensive, and the withdrawal, all of that within a few hours, and the man-to-man combat. Ali ibn Talib, he's, despite that, no doubt shattered as he is, he's tasked to go back. Again, Prophet has to have one of his bravest, strongest soldiers to go out and to scout and find out what's going on, what are the intentions of the Quraysh. Because it could be, because just as they came back, they may try to launch a counter-offensive and try to finish the Muslims off, or as the Muslims are essentially licking their wounds on the mountain, they may the track bypasses Medina. So the track that they came on, and we talked about that when I think when we did the first maps, the track circumvents Medina, so they don't go to Medina, and they sort of have to double back. And the Uhud is to the north of Medina. So he's basically saying, find out which way they're heading. Are they heading the track to Mecca, or are they going to, in fact, go towards Medina? Because obviously, if they're going to go towards Medina and cause havoc there, then the Muslims need to start to defend that. But Ali says, look, no, they're on their camels. They've got no intention of fighting at that point in time. They do actually, 15 sort of miles later, regroup and have second thoughts, and we'll talk about that probably now next time, inshallah. So a couple of other sort of minor stories about the martyrs. A couple of them we've talked about before. So it's said that after the Quraysh had finally gone, then the Prophet dispatched the Muslims to find the dead, those who were shaheed, and the wounded. And Zayd bin Thabit said that the Messenger of Allah sent me on the day of Uhud to seek out Saad bin Ar-Rabi. So the Prophet, I mean, he, obviously he's got some specific knowledge, or there's something that's been said to him that he wants to seek out Saad bin Ar-Rabi. So he sends Zayd, and then he tells Zayd that when you see him, say to Saad, peace be upon you from me, from the Messenger of Allah, and say to him, the Messenger of Allah says, how do you feel? So Zayd has got the specific instructions. He's going out, he's looking for Saad, finds Saad. He said, look, I started wandering around checking all those that were killed until I came across Saad. And when I came across Saad, Saad was lay there dying, about to have his last breath, and he had, and it said again 70, which means a lot. He had 70 strokes or stabs of a sword, a spear, and an arrow in his body. So 70 slashes, wounds, a spear, and an arrow stuck in his body, and he's there bleeding out and about to die. So Zayd says, O Saad, the Messenger of Allah sends you his greetings and says, peace be upon you, and tell me, how do you feel? So then Saad, about to breathe his last, not regretful of the fact that essentially through this battle, he's breathing his last. And then he says, let the peace be upon the Messenger of Allah too, and tell him that I smell the scent of paradise, Jannah. And then, so that's the message for the Prophet ﷺ, that don't worry about me, I can smell Jannah from here. And tell the helpers, right, my people, right, the Ansar, tell my people, you shall not be excused before Allah even if the Messenger of Allah is hurt, and your eyes are still blinking. So basically, essentially saying, whilst you still have, breaths to breathe, you don't have an excuse if a pinprick or a thorn, causes hurt or harm to the Prophet ﷺ. So he's replying to the salam to the Prophet ﷺ, and he's giving a message to his own people. And Saad was well respected, and the message is essentially, there's no excuse. You have to protect the Prophet ﷺ to your dying breath. And then Saad passed away. And then we've talked about this before, but again, this is when it happened. They came across Usairim, and Usairim was Amr bin Thabit. He was one of those who refused to become a Muslim when the Prophet came to Medina, and he entered back into Medina, found it empty, and asked, "Where's everyone?" And they said that they're off to fight. And so he took the Shahada and started to fight. And then he's found, or so he's found again with his dying breaths. So he's on the verge of death, and so they ask him, what have you come here for? We've parted with him, and he was still too arrogant to accept Islam as his religion. So they asked him, what made you come here? Is it out of a desire to defend your people, or is it because of an inclination to Islam? So are you doing this out of pride, like the other chap? Or are you actually doing it to defend Islam? And then he goes again with his dying breaths, it is certainly an inclination to Islam. I believe in Allah and His Messenger, and I have fought with the Messenger of Allah till I have got what you see. It's basically saying, look, I'm a Muslim, and this is the reason I fought. And thereopon, again, sort of almost in that dramatic fashion, he says those last words, essentially does the Shahada on his lips, and then he dies. And then they told the Messenger of Allah about Usairim, and then he affirms that the Prophet because he is one of the inhabitants of paradise. He did very little, but his reward was great. And doing very little, yes, he did the ultimate. He sacrificed his life, but he hadn't gone through all the other trauma and pain and suffering that many of the other Muslims had, like Saad bin Ar-Rabi or Hamza, who were also shaheed. So he did very little, yet his reward is vast. He's got the highest levels of Jannah. Although, and Abu Hurairah later on, as we said before, would tease the students one of these trivial pursuit questions, who got into Jannah without even offering one single prayer, who got in as a Muslim without offering one single prayer. And of those to whom we know, Usairim was one of those who became a Muslim after Fajr, died before it was time to pray. So that is the story of a couple of other stories of the wounded on the battlefield. I'll probably stop there. The wind has picked up. It's probably going to rain, inshallah. Blessings from Allah. And next time we'll talk about the burial of the martyrs. We'll talk about some of the du'as. We'll talk about one of the prisoners of war, the only prisoner of war, the battle of Uhud. And then we'll talk about how the Muslims returned to Medina and then went to Hamra al-Assad, camped out there, and the plots to come back. The Quraysh wanted to come back. So I'll finish there because it started to rain as well. So inshallah, do remember us in your du'as. We're halfway through Ramadan. Let's make dua that the second half is better than the first half for us, inshallah. And obviously we make the most of the last 10 days of Ramadan. And do remember the Ummah in your prayers. Do ask for forgiveness, and Allah is the most forgiving, the most merciful, and He loves to forgive. So please make the most of this. Do remember me in your du'as as well. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel or the Instagram channel. No, these aren't on Instagram, but to the YouTube channel. Do share, and as I said, if you have any comments or questions, just email me or WhatsApp me, inshallah. So we'll finish there. والله إن الإنسان في خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاك الله خير everybody. Assalamu alaikum.